Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. We're going to start a little series within the series on science and Christianity. I want to preface this, just to take some pressure off myself, that I am reading books and collecting information. So I will try to make a presentation, but basically I'm trying to just relay information that I've read, that I've put together. A lot of it is much more, or can become much more complicated than what I'm going to present. Not that it's going to nullify what is being said, but it goes deeper and deeper, and it's more supported. I am not in any means fully, not fully, there, I don't use the word qualified. I'm just trying to, that's what I'm trying to say. I'm not qualified. I'm trying to read information from those who are qualified, from both sides, as far as the believers, those that are not believers. I was just previewing a book, or looking at a book this evening by Anthony Flew, who was one of the main atheists, debated C.S. Lewis at Oxford and a variety of things throughout the 1900s, and towards the end of his life wrote, of the book, There Is a God. Not that he became a Christian, but going back and looking at it, things were switching as far as the scientific evidence. And so we begin with this discussion here, science and Christianity. From the 1500s to the 1850s, per se, Christianity and science were unified. They were aligned. There was no conflict. It wasn't even assumed there would be a conflict. In fact, Western civilization, with the move of Christianity, Western civilization presented the Christian worldview, which laid the foundation for the development of what we call modern science. The things that they presented, that there's order, there's reason. It's not just magic or random. It's got a sequence, an order. And so up until the 1850s, there was no conflict. And many of the scientists that you know of, that you studied in school, they were Christians. In fact, guys like Newton, they had more Bible notes than he had scientific notes in his study after he passed away. He wrote about eschatology. He did a whole work on the book of Daniel and putting times together. And so they did not even consider a conflict between science and Christianity. It was around 1850, the second half of the 1800s, up until the 1950s, that warfare was perceived. And that you can see on the page 1. It says, all those numbers like science, 1, 3, 13, 24, those are for my own reference. Those are books on my shelf. I've got like 30-some books, and I just put them in order. They're just random order, but just as I put them together, 1, 2, 3, so I get a little piece of tape on them, and I've numbered them. So when I put a footnote in, or I want to look at something, I can go there and grab the book and refer to it. But anyway, the second, it says A, Science versus Christianity. And a lot of this information comes from William Lane Craig. And always I would refer, that's, if you wanted to go and find someone that's a professional apologist, William Lane Craig would be an example of someone. But nonetheless, under A, in 1896, Andrew Dickson White, president of the Cornell University, published a book entitled A History of the Warfare of Science and Theology in Christendom. Now that sounds like a great book. It sounds like a great title, and what a great research. It wasn't research. It was him taking his opinion from this time period, right about here. You can see the date, 1896, and just presenting it or overlapping it all of history. It wasn't true. There was no warfare during these years right here, 1500 to the 1850s. In fact, Christianity created modern science. And that's really not debatable. But he, at his time, they are trying to present order because they're breaking away. They're denying a creator. They're denying the text of Scripture. They're going off into naturalism. And so in this book, it became popular, and it became the popular opinion. And the myth of the conflict between Christianity and science, it prevailed up into the 1950s. Now, it prevailed into the 1960s and 70s. I mean, we all lived with the fallout of that kind of thinking. But it was around 1950, 1960, 1970 that the philosophers And the scientists began to establish some principles that we're catching up now, saying, wait a minute, it's not as much of a conflict. In fact, it's based on, even returning back to this time period here. Now, not everyone's going to come along. We're in the postmodern phase. So many are going to embrace this and just run right off the deep end. But truth is calling them back. And when we say truth here, we're talking about natural truth. Going on here on the notes, it says, in the second half of the 20th century, further study revealed, the second half, that'd be this next phase, or this phase, 1950 to our time. Further study revealed that this conflict was a fiction, that there was no conflict between there being a creator and there being a creation that we can study, that there's no conflict. Between the rise of modern science in the 1500s and the late 1800s, science and religion were in alliance to seek the Creator and understand His creation here. There was this time period, with Darwin and all the things that are taking place there, including textual criticism in Scripture. This was really, in a sense, some dark ages in our philosophy, kind of set the stage for where we're at as a culture right now. This modern science that we talk about modern science, we're talking about the practice, the principles, the essence of what we do in science. It was, one of the books says, it was not in the Orient or in Africa that modern science began, but in the Western civilization, because it was influenced with Christianity. The Reformation laid the foundation, and it developed. A guy named Loren Esselstyn, natural science writer and philosopher. He was born in Nebraska. He writes, he lived 1977. He writes, "It is the Christian world which finally gave birth in a clear, articulate fashion to the experimental method of science itself." And he's not a Christian. He's just saying it was the Christian world that gave it the foundation for it to develop, for science to develop. Eastern religions and pagan religions, and this is an important point, Eastern religion and pagan religions view the world itself as divine and indwelt by spirits, where Christianity and the Western world recognize the world to be a product of a creator who is himself outside of the creation or transcendent. The difference there being, and you can see, we're not just talking about in the past somewhere in the world. People who become what we'd say pagan, or they have some kind of false religion, they're going to end up looking into, Romans 1 says, they're going to look at the creation and find God in the creation itself. They're going to end up worshiping the creation. This is where they come from the world, they go back to the world, the spiritual power, whatever spiritual power they sense or feel or recognize, they're going to give the credit to the world. Animals and even man. This is what Paul says. The Christian worldview is this, that there is a God, a transcendent God outside of time, outside of creation, who created the world, who created time, created the natural principles, and He is reflected within it because it's made in, I don't want to say in His nature the way man is made, or in His image the way man is made in His image, but it is a reflection of the Creator. So you're going to have this world that you can study, and you can study the world, but realize there's the Creator outside. The pagan religions, the Eastern religions, they're going to end up putting the deity right there within the creation. And it's going to confuse their science, if you can understand this. If you're just looking at nature, realizing there is a God, a person, a being that created this in an orderly fashion with principles on why it works, then we are free to now discover and examine this creation without thinking we're dealing with God. If you reject the concept of a transcendent God that created this, you still are living on the world. You still have the animals, the nature around you, and you're now going to try and explain it. And this is maybe huge for you to understand, and not because you're simple-minded, but because it's not your perspective. But that this all came out of nothing. So if this all came out of nothing, it's just perchance, it's just random. Anything is possible. And so science now becomes kind of iffy, there's no foundation. But if there's a creator, an absolute creator from eternity past, transcended outside, and he made this, it's solid, it's got principles, it's operating in an orderly fashion. We can now start to not deconstruct, but take these things apart, what's it called, reverse engineer what you see to discover how it's put together. So in one case there's order, in another case you really don't know. And that's the difference between a Christian worldview and a pagan worldview. And that will explain to you why in our culture we are laced with pagan philosophy, pagan religion, and you see us doing all kinds of weird things to nature, to natural things. The way we go after the creation, save the planet. Nothing wrong with being good stewards of what God gave us, but you can, if there's no God, you're going to flip that thing upside down and become radical. If there's no God, there's no order, and now all of a sudden you're in charge, and you can be making all kinds of changes. Nonetheless, point 4 on the Roman numeral there, Eastern religions and pagan religious view of the world itself is that the world is divine and indwelt by spirits. Christianity and the Western world recognize the world to be a product of a creator who is himself outside the creation. Until the late 1800s, scientists saw no conflict with their faith. From 1800s until the 1900s, secular thinkers created the myth that faith undermined naturalism, and because they were so far into naturalism here, Christian faith was imaginary. It was they pushed it away. Thus, the founding of our public school system with Dewey, he was a secular humanist. That was his view. Christianity had no place in the educational system because it was mere faith. It was a mere choice. They made Christianity sound like an option, something people could make up and they could adjust. But they were going to go after the nature. And in a sense, by doing that, they pushed out, and we'll show you here in just a moment, they pushed out the very foundation of their scientific method. And now they're standing on nothing solid. And we'll see that here in a moment. Point 7, from the later 1900s into the 21st century, where we are now, philosophers, and that is, the proof of that statement is Anthony Flew, who was one who rejects the neo-Darwinists, the neo-evolutionists, guys like Dawkins and things. Anthony Flew, an old school from this time period, back in here, from this time period when he died, it was 2001, 2005, I can't remember. When he died, he was rejecting Dawkins and all the neo-evolutionists and neo-Darwinists because they had now left the scientific evidence. Because he was in this time period after the 1950s where philosophy was realizing there are some things within the Christian faith that are foundational, that are real, that we base our own thinking on, that lead us to accept the very reality of Christianity. And so he was ready. By the end, he said, there is a God. There is a God. It's one of those books I want to buy a stack of them, just give them to everybody. Say, read. It's a short little, not short. Yeah, it's short, but it's a little paperback. From the later 1900s to the 21st century, philosophers of science realized that the whole scientific enterprise during this time, they began to realize that the entire scientific enterprise was based on assumptions that cannot be proven scientifically. In other words, what we're doing in science is we're entering science and conducting experiments and using logic based on assumptions that you can't prove these scientifically. We're just going to assume these things are true. But they are part of the Christian worldview. The assumptions that we begin science with, modern Western science, you begin it with some assumptions that come naturally from the Christian community. We assume these things to be true, and so, things start fitting together. You know this in your own life. If you assume certain things are true, if you have a Christian faith, you now approach relationships, you approach your work, you approach your finances, you approach your life, you approach morality with the basic assumption simply that there is a God who's going to judge you someday. So when you enter a relationship, you realize there is a God who is going to hold you accountable. When you deal with finances or if you deal with moral issues, you assume there is a God who's going to hold you accountable or who is leading you, who is guiding you. Prove that. You can't, but it's your assumption, and it directs how you interact. Science is based on that same assumption, and here's some of them right here. Science could not exist without the following assumptions, but yet science cannot prove any of these assumptions scientifically. Number one, the laws of logic. And again, this is important, and we'll probably address this again later. The law of contradictions. If you have two choices, A and B, and they're opposites, they both can't be true. I mean, this is, if we get into debates and logic, that's just the way you argue. They both can't be true. Point C, the principle of identity. That is, one, for the preposition P, it is impossible for both P and not P to be true, or symbolically. In other words, this is not true, and then you got two options. They both can't be true, they both cannot be true. Again, this is, one of those areas I would like to get more into and explain and understand it more. But the basic laws of logic that drive debates, that drive philosophy, that drive scientific conclusions. And when you come to a conclusion, you say, well, it's got to be, this has to be it. How do you know? Why can't this be it? Because they both can't be it. Logic, and it's like, how do you prove that scientifically? It's an assumption. The orderly nature of the external world. We assume that the world has an order. That if there's this creature, this flesh, this species, if it's going to breed, it's going to produce one of its own kind. You're not going to have a rabbit give birth to, frogs. It's like we assume that it's like we see that, but we begin science assuming we're going to find something. The reason we can't, listen, we know we haven't cured cancer, but the reason we're still looking is we know that there's something that causes cancer. We haven't unraveled it yet, but if we keep working, we keep testing, we keep theorizing, we're going to unravel where cancer comes from, which means now we can begin to take steps of curing or eradicating cancer. Now what's that? That's based on the assumption that cancer just doesn't come out of nowhere, that it's not some kind of spiritual being that just moves around, and you may have cancer one day, the next day it's gone, the next day you've got cancer again, or it moves from person to person. We've identified cancer in such a way that we're assuming there's a scientific reason for it based on the assumption that there is natural order in the external world. Number 3, reliability of our cognitive faculties in knowing the world. This means our cognitive and sensory faculties to serve as truth gatherers and as a source of justified true beliefs in our intellectual environment. In other words, the things we can see, the things we can touch, the things we can measure, these things, we can measure things. This is where we're getting truth from, because we really believe that chair is there. We really believe now we can measure the chair, we can touch the chair, we can manipulate the chair. Again, that's an assumption. And some philosophies go down a really weird path and try and deny these things. Number 4, the validity of inductive reasoning, a method of reasoning in which the premise are viewed as supplying some evidence for the truth of the conclusion. And 5, objectivity of the moral values used in science. Science has moral values. A simple example is right here. Test theories fairly and report test results honestly. In other words, even in the science community, if you falsify your information, it's considered immoral. Based on what? It's what I want you to believe. It's what I feel is the truth. It's like, no, that's deceptive. That's a lie. Based on what? They're assuming there's morality somewhere, even within the scientific community. And those are just some examples that were pointed out in several different books, that science is based on some assumptions that can only come from Christianity or the Western worldview. Now we move on to the next thing here, creation. This is what that last thing right there. Science is based on Christian worldview assumptions. Now creation. And this can go on for quite a while, this discussion and this topic. We want to talk sometime about, and I don't have enough material, but there is the idea, where does creation come from? It can be self-existing. And this is in the field existing. In the world of philosophy, in the world of science, this is an option. that the world just exists, and it has been something that people have argued and held to, lived by. It just always exists. You don't need an explanation for it. Here it is. It's always been here. It's always going to be here. It is self-existing. Now, because science will examine this, and we're going to see that this cannot be true. Science itself proves it cannot be self-existing. It cannot just be within itself. It's not God. It's not eternal. It's wearing down. There's all kinds of evidence that what we see today, and this is important to understand, and I know you do, but even in the Christian world, sometimes we get too Sunday schoolistic about this, that God created it, blam, He created it. Now we live for 7,000 years, say, blam, He's going to end it. So we got like this world for 7,000 years. The problem with that is the world we live in today is not the world that Noah lived in. It's definitely not the world that Adam lived in, if you just want to stay in Sunday school for the discussion. And then when Jesus returns and sets up the kingdom, it's going to be a different world. It's the same planet. We're, in a sense, breathing the same air. But the way the waters are, the way the land is shaped, or where the continents are organized, just the temperature, that's a crazy thing. But if there was a flood of Noah, it would have changed the global temperature. There would have been an ice age. There would have been an overheating because of the covering over the earth. And so what we live in today, even in our lifetimes, we don't live long enough to see the vast swing the world can go through. And of course, science has to go back and investigate how the world has changed. So, we do not believe the world is self-existing, but we do believe something came out of nothing. So we definitely see something. So there is something here, and we're going to go with the Western view that something came out of nothing. Now, when I say out of nothing, we're going to define that here a little bit, and that's number one. It is absurd, wrong, fictitious to say that nothing caused something. Saying something came out of nothing is not saying nothing created something. That would be a lack of logic. That nothing's going to produce something. It's completely different to say, point two, it is not absurd to say God made something where there was nothing. So there's something that was made where nothing had existed, and that was done by God. And now when we talk about nothing, get your mind around this, you can't just think of empty space with just a lot of gas and space and nothing in there. You can't even think about gas. You can't even think about space. There's nothing. There's not like this big empty universe. There's no universe. There's no gas, there's no air, there's nothing to measure, there's no thing as time. Nothing, it's nothing. But God is now going to put something where at one point nothing existed. That is going to be creation. So nothing cannot create something, but God can put something where there was nothing. And that's a logical conclusion. That is the view of the Western world and Christianity. And here's your options. Out of nothing, these are some terms. Ek nil nihilo. This is not saying God used some nothing and made something. It means God created something where previously there was nothing. And this is the biblical Genesis word is, or the ideal is ek nihilo. Out of matter. Ek materia. The idea that God made the universe out of pre-existing matter. This is not Christianity. This would be Plato's view. That there was something already there, and God is going to create something out of the material that was there. There's something here, and He's going to then form it. That would be what happened with man. God created man out of the dust of the earth. He created him ek materia. Or, this is interesting, be careful with this, out of God, ek deo. The idea that God took part of himself and made the world from it. Now, your average Christian today would probably have no trouble with this. Progressive Christianity would march right along without even thinking. They don't even have enough capacity to analyze this. The Christian God is a simple whole who has no parts that could be converted into material. So you cannot take God, you cannot take a little bit of God and put it over here and make creation. That is not, creation is not ek out of Deo. It is not out of God. It is ek nihil, meaning it is made something. God made something where there was nothing. He didn't make something out of nothing. He made something where there was nothing. And that, again, I know that sounds, redundant, but those are different views. If you find someone that believes that God made the world out of matter, out of something, that's what's Plato. That's not Christianity. This is radical in the sense of, if you consider what Moses was writing, editing, putting together in the book of Genesis. And I'm reading a commentary on Genesis right now, just in the evenings before we go to bed, with a couple other books every once in a while. And what is being said there, something I didn't realize, it's really obvious, because Moses was from Egypt. And in Egypt, they were pagans. Their world was ek materia. It came out of something, or it was ek deo. It came from the gods. And again, without becoming too sexually graphic, and some of the books I've done are not sexually graphic, but it's like you wouldn't want to pass around in a children's Sunday school room because of the Egyptian gods and how they created. They're making the world from themselves. And so the world itself, the sun was a god, or a part of the god. The moon was another god. And the sun was judgmental and observing. The moon had its own standards and was observing and revolving around everything. The animals, everything had part of God or was made by the gods out of some other material. It was all pagan religion. And so here was mankind living in this, fearful of this deity here and this deity here. Now we laugh at this. We think, wow, that's not real. Right, because you're coming out of the Western world. You're coming out of Christianity. Your struggle is with secularism. And we're not even afraid of anything because it's all nothing. We're not even afraid of hell. We're not even afraid of God. Nothing exists except what we can measure. So we're on the different side of this pendulum. When Moses begins to write, and this is not to say he's not writing truth, but he's going out of his way to identify that God made something out of nothing, and on this day he made the sun and the moon. And they were, from the very beginning of the Jewish religion, the sun was a creation. It was a creation of God for a purpose. The sun will not harm you by day. The moon will not harm you by night. There's nothing there. Again, we're not talking about sun, moon, and moon burn or moon stroke or something. We're talking about the sun can't hurt you. You don't have to honor the sun and pour out drink offerings to the sun or the moon. There's nothing there. Man is in the creation that God made, and everything that he sees and touches was put there by God for a purpose. It is under God's jurisdiction, and man was placed there. So Moses takes the entire, this is radical, because he takes the entire Egyptian cosmology and he was well trained. He knew all the details of it, and it's like, no, there is this God who created, it's radical on this presentation. And again, the Israelites had lived there for several hundred years, and so they were indoctrinated with this Egyptian view of life. They'd seen the Egyptians worship, the pharaohs, all the routines. But anyway, that's one side of it. Then, of course, we're on the other side. So that's where this ek nihilo, ek materia, ek deo. Point 3 on page 2, God is infinite and the world he created is finite. This is it again. Nothing radical here. God is infinite. The world He created is finite. And this is going to be very important, because if this is true, we should be able to find this, prove this, measure this. It's finite. And that leads down here in the next part. The world had to have a beginning, but God by definition cannot have a beginning. He is without time and without material. So again, I remember asking my grandfather this question. He died in 1979 when I was 19, and I spent a lot of time with him. He fought in World War I, and there's a lot of little lessons I learned from him that I could tell you. But I remember asking him, where God came from, because that's a question every kid asks, where did God come from? And that's a logical question, because everything we see, touch, or experience is in time. It came from somewhere. Like, where did our parents come from? Where did the mountains come from? How old is this? Where is this going? Everything's within. Everything is material. Everything is in time. So everything had a beginning, and everything had an end, or will have an end. And I remember realizing that one time. I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and I realized I was going to die. And it freaked me out. I told you that story before. It's like I went running out of my bedroom. It was like 9 o'clock at night. It's like, I don't want to die. I don't want to die. And my mom and dad were like, what? They're watching Johnny Carson or whatever. It's like, what? It's like, what's wrong? I'm going to die. It's like, I just realized that this isn't going to stay. This is going to be like this forever. I was an exceptional child. But nonetheless, where did God come from? And again, with what I'm going to say, I don't have any trouble with this now, in this moment. But you hit me up during the day and ask me the question, and I'm not in the mood of logically thinking. It can still make your mind swim. How can God always be? How can God always exist? It's like, whoa, it almost just bends your mind. It's like, right, in here, because it doesn't fit. Because in here, everything in here has material. It is locked in time. It had a beginning, it has an end. Everything here is like that. And to take God and put Him in here, it's like doing this. God. It's like, whoa! Right? It doesn't fit in there, and it's not supposed to. So, but how can you say God had no beginning? Well, because God created this thing called time. And if there's no time, there's no beginning. You understand that? In here, there's time, because God took time. Tick, 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 in here. But out here, there's no time. So that means He's always existed. How can that be? Because He's not in here. He's outside of the time. He's an identity outside of anything we've known. So this is really, when you think about it that way, this is not a hard question. It still is, but when you think about it this way, God can't have a beginning. God can't not exist. He is, our world that we live, think of yourselves living in a bubble. Think of yourselves living in creation. Think of yourself being a creature with a beginning, with an end, living in time, made out of material. You're in here. And you're trying to look through this, like one of the Beatles songs, The Glass Onion or something. And you're looking out here, and it's like you're trying to see this God who is, He's not visible. He's not here. He's outside of that whole thing. And so that takes some pressure off it. In other words, that's Christian philosophy. That's the Western world concept of infinite and finite. Now we come back to this finite world. We just talked about infinite basically. God is infinite. He's outside of time. He's outside of material. And that helps explain the question, where did God come from? How can God always be? Well, He's not here, so He's never had a beginning. But everything has to have a beginning. Right. In the box, in the circle, in creation. But if you're outside the box, if you're outside creation, no, you don't have to have a beginning. You would be God, because you created the box. So this next point right here, point 3 on page 2, where it says the universe had a beginning. Scientific proof. Here we begin. The second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics, again, please, just a little reminder, let's all take a breath. I'm getting information from books, and it's nothing new. You just Google apologetics, where did the world come from? There it is. I mean, everybody has this available. It would be nice if every church hammered their congregations like this, so that they would have this. It would be just free-flowing knowledge instead of some like mind-bending information. I remember teaching a class like this at one of the churches here in town. It was what they call one of the bigger churches, and they thought this was. I was teaching a college-age class, and we had 25, 30 people coming. Some of the adults were coming into the class, which caused conflict because they didn't want to go to the adult class. They wanted to come to this class, and that caused conflict. But I was teaching this kind of stuff to college-age kids. I mean, you can see how useless this would be for a college-age student this is not even anything they're interested in. It's like, wait, this is exactly what they would be. And if they didn't get it in youth group, you should get it when you're college age. And if the adults are drifting into the class, maybe they should have had information on this. But anyway, this is pertinent information. Point 1a. The second law of thermodynamics states that the universe is running out of usable energy. This is not a Christian theory. This is scientific proof. If you go to college, you go to university, you study science, this is taught as factual, because it is factual. It's testable. So running out of usable energy. We're talking now about energy, where you got usable. You can burn up energy. Energy always moves to another form, but it always goes to a lower state of form that eventually can't be used. And so the world has a set amount of energy. And as the time goes on, we're using this energy up. Now this is, I don't want to get too far above my pay grade here. The first law of thermodynamics, the quantity of energy. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. The total quantity of energy in the universe stays the same. So you've got this amount of energy. The universe has this amount. It was given this amount of energy in the beginning. As it's going through, the second law of thermodynamics kicks in, the quality of that energy. It states that as energy is transferred or transformed, more and more of it is wasted. This is not a verse in the Bible, although it is in Psalms and Hebrews, where it says the earth will wear out. It says he'll change it like he changes a garment. So again, this is not a biblical, in a sense, this is what Christianity believes, but it is what the psalmist and the writer of Hebrews attested to. It states that energy is transferred or transformed. More and more of it is wasted. It also states that there is a natural tendency of an isolated system to degenerate into a more disorderly state. So this is talking energy is becoming more useless, which means we will potentially eventually run out of usable energy. We will wear down, just like Hebrews and Psalm says. But also, this points out it goes to a state of disorder. In other words, this is saying in the beginning there was a point. If it's going somewhere, if you can count this, if it's going from a place of order to a place of disorder, and it's not a cycle. It's not like you have spring cleaning and you get everything back to order. It was at one time ordered, and it's becoming more disorderly, the universe. it was usable energy, a certain amount, is becoming more useless. It's wearing down. And that means you're going right here. You're doing this. You're at, right here, if you're going 25, 26, 27. And the very fact that, and you're counting, measuring something, means if there was a 25, there was a 24. If there was a 24, there was a 23. If there was a 23, there was a 20. If there was a 20, there was a 50. You eventually had to get to a 1. And if there's a 1, there had to be a 0 or a beginning. And this is what the finite universe shows us, that there is we can count time. We can count energy. We can measure order going to disorder, which means things are progressing from order to disorder, from useful to useless. Time is moving on, which means there was a beginning, which supports the concept that we are in a finite world that is temporary. It's going somewhere. It had a beginning. It's going to have... Now this lines up with the Western world. This lines up with Christianity. But this is science. Now you can imagine some Eastern religion. You can imagine some kind of paganism. You can imagine the Egyptians and their gods with the sun and the moon trying to explain this. They're going to stumble all over this. But this is the world we live in, and it matches the Bible that was revealed to us. And this is one of the tests for Christianity. Does the world you live in match your religion? Right here. And that's what the beautiful... You can't take an Eastern religion and then look at the world. It's like, well, and you've got to adjust because it doesn't match your religion. It doesn't even match everything Plato said, for example. Going on here, it says, point B, very quickly. If the universe is running down, it cannot be eternal. It does not take forever to run out of limited amount of energy. So this world will not last. Save the earth. The earth is going to end. There's an end in sight. Now when Jesus returns and renews it, burns it up and restores it, or recreates a new heaven and earth, again, I have not myself determined what's going to happen. If it's going to be this earth is burned up and then there's a completely new created heaven and earth, or if this is burned up and cleansed and then reinstated in a perfect condition that is perpetual energy. Again, are we going to be on this exact planet with perpetual energy for eternity when Christ sets up His kingdom? Or is He going to just throw this away and create a brand new one? I can argue either case, and you can find verses. I'm not ready to, throw down the gauntlet on that yet. I used to be able to, but then I've kind of withdrawn from that. And so point C, let's talk about science today, the world we live in. So the universe is finite with finite energy. An example, the fact that a car ran out of gas means there was at a point that the car had, I put filled up with gas, that means you had a full tank. But it means that if you ran out of gas, that means at one point someone put gas into it and you ran out. If the universe had a beginning, then the universe had a beginner. If it's not self-existing and it's running out of energy, it had a beginning, but it couldn't begin itself. It had to have a beginner. So all of this is screaming for a beginning, and if there is a beginning of all of this, there had to be something out here beginning it. Thus, guys like Anthony Flew, as they approach the end of their life, coming out of the 1900s, they stop and says, there is something here. I mean, it's like, he says in his book, in a sense, he says, I've always been an honest man. I always have followed the evidence. And in the 1940s, 1950s, the evidence was naturalism. But as we progressed and science has developed, and especially with he was talking about the DNA and different things like this, it's like, no. This is not self-existent. There is a God. Now, who He is, what He is, and he even talked, I almost brought it and read you the chapter at the end because it's kind of neat. Because he says, if He wants to reveal Himself to me, I'm willing to recognize it. But I have not met this God. Now again, we've met Him through Christianity, we've met Him through the Scriptures. But this is Anthony Flew coming at it. He's rejected Scripture, he's rejected. But he does accept, again, I don't want to get off on that, but he does accept the fact that Some people have argued with him about miracles, including C.S. Lewis, who was defeated in an argument one time at Oxford, and others, that miracles are possible if there's a God, obviously, and that revelation from this God, he says, is not just possible, it's probable. Meaning, if there's a God out here that began it, he says it's probable he's revealed himself to us. We're just missing it. Now again, that's Anthony Flew, an atheist who debated C.S. Lewis on radio in London or in the UK, and there was the famous debates. And at the end, he's like, okay. Anyway. Speculation, point F. Speculation. Maybe the universe is self-rebounding or self-recreating. That is one of the scientists there. That's what they're trying to do scientifically, philosophically today. What are we going to do? Maybe it's self-rebounding. Maybe the earth just runs out and rewinds itself up and starts again, like the seasons. Now, is there proof of that? No. There's no proof of it. But philosophically, it could be true. Right? Just like there could be a billion different universes. Anything's possible. This is speculation, science fiction, and no demonstrable evidence. So listen to this, just because someone can say, maybe it's self-regenerating, maybe it's self-rebounding, it's like, that's not what we see. That's not what we see in the laws of thermodynamics. If that's the case, we have no evidence of it. That's your philosophy. But now, we've got as much proof here, more here, because our text lines up with what's happening here. Your idea, you're going to have to find another world where that's taking place, or find some period in time where that snaps into action. You're making up a myth. Plus it would undermine the second law of thermodynamics. Agnostic astronomer Robert Jastrow said, once hydrogen has been burned within that star and converted to heavier elements, it can never be restored to its original state. Minute by minute and year by year, as hydrogen is used up by stars, the supply of this element grows smaller. So this is the astronomer saying, we're running out of, now again, it's not like, we're going to start picketing or something, but it's happening. It's like, this is because of, the automobile, the petroleum industry, the conservatives. This is because of the way the universe was made. Second law of thermodynamics means the universe cannot be eternal because it had no beginning, or if it had no beginning, or if it was eternal, it would have ran out of energy already. Okay, if it had no beginning, it would have ran out of energy already. If it had no beginning, or it was eternal, it would have already reached the state of total disorder by now. So putting these two things together, if we say, okay, are you with me on this one? We're going to take away this concept. We say there is no beginning. The earth is eternal. If the earth is eternal, that means it's been using up energy forever and ever and ever. Which means, if that's true, there's no energy left. Or, if the world is becoming more and more disorderly, if there was no beginning, it's been becoming more and more disorderly forever and ever and ever. We're in complete chaos right now. But the fact is, we still have some order left. We still have some usable energy left. That means it hasn't been going on forever and ever and ever, which again proves there was a beginning. But there's going to be some kind of an end. Now this is, really, what I'm telling you is not my opinion. This is not like just this is logic. You're going to have to renounce logic if you're going to go get anywhere else with this. Page 3. Okay, philosophical proof. The impossibility, I'm on page 3.2, the impossibility of an infinite number of moments. If the universe was eternal and had no beginning, then we would have already had an infinite amount of moments before now, which is a passing moment in time which can be counted. In other words, we would be in eternity right now, which we're not in eternity because we're counting it. B, if there had already been an infinite amount of moments, there could be no now in time. We would be in eternity. Infinity cannot be traversed since it has no beginning and no end. If there's no beginning and no end, once you're in eternity, you're there and you're there. That's why there's no age. You're just there. in this state of eternity. You've got to come into the planet, into the universe, into creation to grow old. But if our universe has time that can be traversed to get to today, this means there had to be a beginning of time to start passing through. Do you remember yesterday? You're no longer there. You anticipate tomorrow, but right now you're here. It used to be 7 o'clock. We're working towards 8 o'clock, which means we are moving through time, which means you can't be in eternity. You're in time right now. If there was a beginning of time, there logically has to be a beginner. Skeptic David Hume, and you've heard his name before, never denied things have a cause for their existence. Hume wrote, I never asserted, he was one of the skeptics, but he says, I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause. Even the skeptic says it can't just start to exist. There has to be a cause. The temporal world has a beginning, he said. An infinite number of real parts of time passing in succession and exhausted one after another appears so evident a contradiction that no man, one should think, whose judgment is not corrupted, instead of being improved by the sciences, would ever be able to admit it. So in other words, he's saying, what we're saying here, has to be. Even the skeptic can't be skeptical of this. Oh, then I've got two things here. I just want to point these out. Again, my notes here are incomplete. We want to come back to evolution eventually, and that will be another subject. There's synthesizing evolution. That's going to be a section. I don't have any notes there. But where they tried to duplicate evolution. And there was some little experiment they did in the 1950s or something, and they thought they had it. But the thing is, they began with everything they needed. To have true evolution, you've got to start with nothing. If you put stuff in there, the enzymes in the little test tube, in the little aquarium, and send a current of electricity through it, you're starting with, so that's not evolution. That's you using material. And so that's it's always used in textbook. Oh, look, this happened. Right, but go back and look what they did to cause that to happen. They set it up so you could create it. Mutations, talk about because mutations, a lot of times they say things mutated, and we'll talk about that. DNA. This is just a couple interesting things. There's a diagram of a DNA. Again, this is me presenting information. This is not me with a doctor's degree in genetic studies. This is me presenting to the believer some support for your faith. You are not out on a limb. You are getting the truth. The discovery science is getting closer and closer to finding your faith to be legitimate. The DNA in one cell in a human body holds as much information as 8,000 books. So if you have, there's on the next page, you can see a diagram of a cell. But if this is a cell, which is very weak, there is in that cell, in the DNA, in one cell in the human body, holds as much information as 8,000 books. Imagine 8,000 books and all the texts and details, the letters, the thoughts, the complete thoughts in those books. That's what is inside one human cell. A human body has 100 trillion cells. That's thousands, millions, billions. I need another 3, I think. That's how many cells you've got in the human body. So every cell's got as much as 8,000 books worth of information. I mean, we're talking. Your calculator won't even work that. The information, point 2, the information storage capacity of DNA far surpasses even the most powerful electronic memory system known today. Molecular biologist Michael Denton notes that for all the different types of organisms that have ever lived, the necessary information in their DNA for the construction of their proteins could be held in a teaspoon, and there would still be room left for all the information in every book ever written. That's how much information. DNA can hold that much information. I mean, like you think about a memory stick, you think about a gigabyte, think about just forgot what but anyway, the DNA dwarfs anything we've got. But DNA does not just store information, watch, in combination with other cellular systems, it also processes information. See, it's going to have to take information and connect it. It's not just storage, it's not just a storage unit, it's an interactive unit that's taken, we need this information now, and it's making contact with that information to produce what it needs to produce. Hence, Bill Gates likens DNA to a computer program, though far more advanced. So don't just think of DNA being able to hold information like a memory stick. Think of it now, like Bill Gates says, as a computer program. It's got this huge amount of memory, which is a huge amount of information, but it is also not just storing it, it is also using it, processing it, doing stuff with it in a cell. A body has 100 trillion cells. I mean, you can't. Now, you understand what we're about to say. This now just happened. This just evolved out of nothing. It's like, no, if there was a beginning, and you start with a one-celled organism that then began to split. Okay, you've already lost one cell. It's like you've got enough DNA in there to hold. You can't just start with one cell. Someone's got to build it, program it, and then it's going to have to do all the things it's been designed to do. It goes on, it says this, point 3 on page 4. Work has been done by MIT computational quantum physicist Seth Lloyd. And you can read this whole thing. And he goes through and talks about the chances that they get all of the time that the universe supposedly has existed and all the possibilities. And you put it together, the best odds it could, and putting down any kind of an organized code that is needed for DNA, it's virtually, I mean not virtually, it is impossible. You can't even put a little bit together. The best you could do is make that little statement bold, not bold, but capital letters, out of Shakespeare, that line from Shakespeare. That would be the best. If you took all of history, all of time, you have the potential that you could randomly create that line. Not a guarantee. That's potential that you could create that. But you're going to have to create all the writings of Shakespeare to pull this off. And yet, you only have the potential of getting this one line. The cell. Let's briefly look at the cell magnified 1 billion times. This is now, I'm quoting someone. On its surface we find millions of openings like portholes in a ship. Now this is amazing if you can follow this. See, I drew a cell. There's a cell, see? And Darwin's cell was simple. You've got 100 trillion cells in your body with DNA inside those cells. It says, let's look briefly at a cell magnified 1 billion times. On its surface we find millions of openings like portholes in a ship. But these are not mere portholes. They regulate the flow of materials in and out of the cell. Cells have exhibited nano-engineering. Did you hear that word? Nano-engineering, meaning nano-engineering on a scale and sophisticated that scientists have hardly begun to scratch it. They've just begun to recognize it's there, let alone explain it. Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of DNA's structure, described the cell as a miniature factory bustling with rapid organized chemical activity. With this in the early 1980s. Scientists now think of the cell as an automated city. A cell as an automated city. Inside the cell we find a host of raw materials maneuvered back and forth by, listen to this, by robot-like machines all working in unison. In fact, many different objects move in perfect unison through a seemingly endless conduit. The level of control in these choreographed moments is truly mind-blowing. We're still talking about a cell, not 100 trillion cells. The level of control in these choreographed movements is truly mind-blowing, and this is just one cell. Oh, I just said that. In a large organism, cells must work together for the proper function of organs, such as hearts. It's not just one cell functioning. All these cells are functioning to make your heart look like it's a heart. Then you got to break it down. The heart's complicated, but think about the cells that are making the heart function. Now throw the brain in there. And then it goes on and says hearts, eyes, livers, ears, and these in turn must work together for life, for the organism, for your body to function. We go to the doctor if we've got a problem with one of the little features of our body. If we peer further inside the cell, going into the cell, we find coils of DNA that store information necessary to construct proteins. Proteins themselves are remarkably complex molecular systems. A typical protein is composed of a few hundred amino acids arranged in precisely ordered sequence that then folds into a highly organized three-dimensional structure. That's what we saw on the DNA page there. That the structure enables the protein to perform its function inside the cell. Biologists today cannot even describe the activities inside the cell without comparing it to machines and other feats of modern engineering. The reason is that nearly every feature of our own advanced technology can be found in the cell. Somewhere in here I thought I had it written down how long it is if you unfold it. Oh yeah, there it is on DNA page 3. The DNA in one cell, it says, I told you it was 100 trillion cells, each with a DNA strand that could uncoil to about 10 feet. So if you pulled the DNA out and you took that coiled up model of that and you stretched out, it would be 10 feet, it would be as high as this room in a cell with the information to develop protein in that cell. And it's like, you understand, with just that evolution, the way they describe evolution, they know it's no matter a matter of faith. It's they've looked at it and it's like this Darwin's. That's why they call themselves neo-Darwinists, because no one is following Darwin. They can't. They're neo-Darwinists, and now they've got to explain. They've got to explain this concept of where did this come from, which is demanding a beginning with a beginner, the creator, and who is that creator? That's what they're trying. They're now trying to come up with, how did this happen? It happened. We have no theory for it. So they're coming up with theories, and I'll get you through some of those theories. But it's just a matter. I don't want to just make fun of them, but it'd be interesting to hear what they're coming up with. And they're being forced. They're in a debate. If we participate or if we don't participate, the secular world is in a debate with God, who's just pushing them closer and closer to the edge of the cliff, where they are going to have to embrace Him or just get pushed off into oblivion. Because it's like they can't make any sense out of this. The human mind cannot come up with any explanation on what is taking place here, other than in the beginning, God. And again, that's not very well. We've got the answer. What's exciting is we've got the answer. But when we start looking at this right here, it's like when you read this, then you see this. It's like, it's not like God just like out there just like snapped His fingers and there everything was. It's like He organized nano engineering all the way down this DNA in a place that we still can't. We don't understand. We don't, like I talk about churches, we don't understand the spiritual dimension. Look at this. We don't even understand the inner workings of our body, the inner cell, the DNA, all these things. It just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so again, I'll quit with that. I'll pray and we're free to go. Father, we thank you again for the chance to look into these things. We thank you for putting evidence of your creation, evidence of your character, of your presence in our world. We ask that we again would handle these things diligently, not just make things up, but Father, that we would embrace truth and stand firm in the faith. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you for your time.